Do you think about the sounds of absolute silence at 30 degrees below zero? I've been researching what sleep meant when the American frontier turned into a frozen wasteland, and what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about survival. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that's part history, part mystery, and entirely true. A story that took me 3 years to piece together from fragments scattered across archives, museums, and archaeological sites from Montana to Texas. Before we begin this exploration together, I'd appreciate if you could hit that like button. It tells me you're ready for this journey into winter's most challenging chapter. Make sure to subscribe because I bring you these deep historical dives regularly. Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are and what brought you here tonight. Some of you might be settling in for the night, others starting your day. It doesn't matter. History connects us all, so get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's explore what I call the forgotten art of frontier winter sleep. This research began when I stumbled upon a collection of letters in the Montana Historical Society archives, correspondence between a homesteader named Martha Henley and her sister back in Vermont. One particular passage stopped me cold. "Sleep here isn't rest, Emma. It's a negotiation with death itself. Every night we bargain with the cold, offering our vigilance in exchange for the hope of morning." That single paragraph sent me down a 3-year rabbit hole that would consume my life and fundamentally change how I understood human resilience. What started as curiosity about frontier hardships became an obsession with understanding how ordinary people survived extraordinary circumstances. I travelled to over 40 historical sites, interviewed descendants of frontier families, worked with archaeologists uncovering homestead ruins, and consulted with sleep researchers to understand the physiological aspects of what these people endured. The picture that emerged was far more complex and fascinating than any Hollywood Western had ever suggested. I started this research when I found a diary entry from 1872 Wyoming. A woman had written, "Sleep here isn't rest. It's warfare against the cold." That single line sent me down a rabbit hole of discovery that consumed months of my life. What I learned will surprise you. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that frontier sleep was an entirely different category of human experience. These weren't just people making do with less comfortable beds. They were fundamentally reimagining what sleep could be under impossible circumstances. I found evidence of sleep practices that seemed almost ritualistic, survival strategies that bordered on the supernatural, and human adaptations that challenged everything sleep scientists thought they knew about our basic needs. My research took me to the University of Wyoming's American Studies Department, where Professor Sarah Mitchell had been collecting oral histories from descendants of frontier families for over 20 years. She introduced me to a concept that would become central to my understanding: survival sleep. This wasn't the restorative sleep we know today, but a hypervigilant state that allowed for rest while maintaining awareness of mortal threats. These people developed what we might call a sixth sense about danger while sleeping, Professor Mitchell explained during one of our many conversations. They could detect changes in wind patterns, animal sounds, even shifts in temperature while seemingly unconscious. It was an adaptation born of absolute necessity. Picture this: January 1872, somewhere in the Wyoming Territory. I'm standing in what remains of a homestead, trying to understand how anyone survived here. The reconstruction shows me a single room, maybe 12 by 14 feet, built from logs that were cut in desperation as winter approached. The gaps between these logs, some wide enough to stick your finger through, But this particular site, excavated by Dr. James Morrison's team from the Colorado School of Archaeology, revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the floorboards, they discovered a complex system of stones arranged in geometric patterns. These weren't random. They were carefully placed to create thermal mass, storing heat from the day and releasing it slowly through the night. The pioneers hadn't just built a cabin. They'd engineered a primitive but effective heating system that worked with the natural laws of thermodynamics. The archaeologists explained to me how these pioneers tried to seal those gaps. Mud, moss, strips of fabric, even pages torn from precious books. But the wind always found a way in. Always. I learned that breath would fog inside these cabins, that ice would form on the interior walls in decorative patterns that were beautiful and terrifying. Dr. Morrison showed me fragments of what appeared to be some kind of insulation material found in the walls. Chemical analysis revealed it to be a mixture of mud, animal hair, plant fibers, and something unexpected: human hair. Families had literally woven themselves into their homes, using their own hair as insulation. This discovery led me to understand that frontier homes weren't just shelters. They were extensions of the families who built them, integrated with their bodies in ways we can barely comprehend today. Let me walk you through what I discovered about the rhythm of winter survival. These people rose before dawn not by choice, but because the fire had died overnight. If they didn't rekindle it immediately, the cold would penetrate so deeply that movement became agony. I examined boots from this period, leather so stiff from freezing that forcing your feet into them meant risking frostbite. My investigation into frontier footwear led me to the National Museum of American History, where curator Dr. Elizabeth Chen showed me an extraordinary collection of frontier boots. Each pair told a story of adaptation and desperation. Some had metal studs hammered into the soles, not for traction, but to create air pockets that provided minimal insulation from frozen ground. Others had been modified with layers of animal fur sewn inside, creating primitive but effective winter linings. What's remarkable, Dr. Chen explained, is how these modifications were made. Families would work together during autumn evenings, each person contributing their skills. Children would gather animal hair that had caught on thorns and fences. Women would spin it into crude yarn. Men would punch holes in the leather with awls heated in fires. The entire process could take weeks for a single pair of boots. But the most fascinating discovery was a pair of boots found in a collapsed cabin in North Dakota. These boots had been fitted with what appeared to be primitive heating elements. Thin metal plates that could be heated in a fire and slipped into pockets sewn into the boot's lining. The metallurgy was crude but effective, demonstrating that some frontier families were developing sophisticated solutions to survival challenges. The sleeping arrangements fascinated me even more. What they called a bed was essentially a wooden frame with rope webbing, topped by a mattress stuffed with prairie grass they'd gathered during summer. The grass had compressed under months of use, offering minimal cushioning. Below this makeshift bed, rough planks with gaps through which the frozen earth exhaled cold upward. However, my research with Dr. Sarah Bellingham, a textile historian at the Smithsonian, revealed that these bedding arrangements were far more sophisticated than they initially appeared. The prairie grass wasn't randomly stuffed into mattress covers. It was carefully selected and arranged. Families would gather specific types of grasses during late summer, each variety chosen for its insulating properties, moisture resistance, and durability. They created a layered system, Dr. Bellingham explained as she showed me preserved samples. The bottom layer was usually buffalo grass, which is naturally oil-resistant and doesn't compress as much. The middle layer might be switchgrass, which creates excellent air pockets. The top layer was often sedge grasses, which are naturally antimicrobial and help prevent the growth of mold and bacteria. The rope webbing itself was an engineering marvel. I learned from master rope maker Thomas Hartwell, who studies traditional American cordage techniques, that frontier families developed specific weaving patterns for bed ropes. The tension had to be precisely calibrated. Too tight, and the ropes would snap in cold weather as they contracted. Too loose, and they provided no support. They used a technique called seasonal tensioning, Hartwell demonstrated on a recreation frame in his workshop. The ropes were woven tighter in summer, allowing for the contraction that would occur in winter. Some families even used different types of rope for different seasons. Hemp rope in summer, twisted rawhide in winter, because rawhide actually becomes stronger when it's cold and dry. I held blankets from this era, heavy wool that was scratchy and perpetually damp from condensed breath. These people also treasured buffalo robes, hides that smelled of smoke and animal fat but held heat like nothing else. On the worst nights, they piled everything they owned on top of themselves and still felt the cold creeping in. My examination of surviving textiles at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science revealed the incredible ingenuity of frontier bedding. Dr. Michael Torres, the museum's fiber specialist, showed me how families would create layered sleeping systems that rivaled modern outdoor gear in their effectiveness. "Look at this buffalo robe," he said, pointing to a specimen that was nearly 200 years old. "This isn't just a hide thrown over the sleeper. The Native American tanners who prepared this used a process that took months. They would work brain oils into the hide using specific techniques that created millions of microscopic air pockets. The result was a material that was simultaneously windproof, breathable, and incredibly insulating. Beneath the buffalo robes, families layered wool blankets. But these weren't the uniform factory-made blankets we know today. Many were hand-woven using wool from their own sheep, and the patterns weren't just decorative, they were functional. Dr. Torres showed me how certain weaving patterns created channels that directed moisture away from the sleeper's body, while others created pockets that trapped warm air. This particular blanket, he said, indicating a worn grey specimen, was woven with what we call a thermal gradient pattern. The weave is tighter at the head and foot sections, where heat loss is greatest, and looser at the torso, where the body generates the most heat. The person who made this understood thermodynamics in ways that most textile manufacturers today don't even consider. What struck me most in my research was how sleep preparation began hours before bedtime. As afternoon light failed and winter daylight ended around 4 p.m., the careful rationing of firewood began. I studied the remains of lean-tos where they stored wood that was never, ever enough. Finding dry timber on the sparse frontier was nearly impossible during the brief summer, when they were frantically growing food and making repairs. My investigation into frontier fuel management led me to consult with Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a forestry historian at Oregon State University. She explained that wood scarcity wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a matter of life and death, and families developed incredibly sophisticated systems for maximizing their fuel efficiency. They practiced what we might call thermal engineering, Dr. Hoffman explained during a demonstration at her university's experimental forest. Families would scout their territory throughout the year, identifying trees that had fallen naturally, deadfall that had been properly seasoned by weather. They learned to recognize wood types by sight and sound, how different species burned, which ones produced the most heat per volume, which ones burned slow and steady versus fast and hot. The wood selection process was almost scientific. Oak and hickory were prized for their long, steady burn. Pine was avoided unless desperate, because it burned too fast and produced dangerous sparks. Apple and cherry woods were treasures, burning clean and steady with pleasant smoke that wouldn't irritate airways in confined spaces. But the real innovation was in wood preparation. Families would split logs to specific dimensions based on the time of day and weather conditions. Thick logs for overnight burning, thin splits for quick heating when rekindling morning fires, medium pieces for cooking fires that needed to maintain steady temperatures. The evening routine was ritualistic. Check the door against wind and animals. Wolves howled regularly in the darkness. Position boots near the fire. Lay out tomorrow's clothes, hoping proximity to heat would make them less frigid. Add one final log to the fire, knowing it had to last until morning. I spent considerable time with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, an anthropologist at the University of New Mexico who specializes in frontier domestic rituals. She helped me understand that these evening routines weren't just practical necessities. They were psychological anchors that helped families maintain sanity and hope through the darkest months. The ritual aspect was crucial, Dr. Martinez explained. When your survival depends on performing the same actions correctly every single night, those actions become sacred. Families would often pray together during these preparations, not just asking for protection, but expressing gratitude for making it through another day. She showed me diary entries describing evening routines in remarkable detail. Families would check and recheck their preparations with an almost obsessive precision. Children were assigned specific tasks: gathering kindling, arranging tomorrow's clothes, checking that food stores were secure against rodents. These weren't arbitrary chores, they were survival education, ensuring that even young children understood what was necessary to survive. They had developed an art called banking the coals, covering embers with ash to slow combustion while keeping them alive. Sometimes they succeeded and woke to embers they could coax back to flame. Sometimes they failed and faced the much harder task of starting fresh. My study of frontier fire management techniques led me to Master Firekeeper Jonathan Rowe, who has spent 40 years studying and recreating traditional American fire skills. In his workshop in Vermont, he demonstrated the precise techniques that meant the difference between waking to warmth or waking to potentially fatal cold. Banking coals isn't just about covering them with ash, Rowe explained as he worked. It's about understanding airflow, fuel consumption rates, and ember preservation. You need to create a micro-environment where combustion continues at exactly the right rate. Fast enough to maintain viable coals, slow enough to last 8 to 10 hours. The process required specific types of ash, applied in specific ways. Hardwood ash was preferred because it contained mineral compounds that helped maintain ember temperature. The ash had to be completely dry. Any moisture would create steam that could extinguish the coals. The covering technique involved creating a dome that allowed minimal airflow while protecting the coals from drafts. Frontier families would often compete to see who could maintain coals the longest, Rowe continued. Children would learn by watching their parents, gradually taking over the responsibility as they proved their competence. A family's survival could literally depend on a 12-year-old's ability to bank coals properly. Some families developed elaborate systems involving multiple fire banking sites. They would maintain coals in a main fireplace, but also in smaller fireplaces, outdoor fire pits protected by shelters, even in buried coal pits that could maintain embers for days if properly managed. Then came the moment of truth. Approaching their bed, they already knew how cold it would be. The blankets had been sitting in the cabin's ambient temperature all day. Some learned to heat stones in their fire, wrap them in cloth and place them in bed for warmth. These stones worked for about an hour before becoming just heavy, cooling rocks taking up space. My research into heated stone techniques led me to some fascinating discoveries. I worked with Dr. Patricia Clearwater, a thermal engineer at MIT who had become interested in frontier heating methods through her own family genealogy. Together, we conducted experiments to understand exactly how these heated stone systems worked and why some families achieved better results than others. The key was in the stone selection, Dr. Clearwater explained in her laboratory. Families learned through trial and error, sometimes fatal error, which stones worked best. Limestone was dangerous because it could explode when heated. Sandstone was safe but didn't retain heat well. River rocks were ideal. They heated evenly and held temperatures for hours. Our experiments revealed that successful families had developed sophisticated stone preparation techniques. The stones would be gradually heated over several hours, not thrown directly into flames. This prevented thermal shock that could crack them. They would be heated to specific temperatures, hot enough to provide warmth, but not so hot as to burn skin even through protective wrapping. The wrapping materials were carefully chosen. Wool flannel was ideal because it insulated while allowing some heat transfer. Linen was less effective but more readily available. Some families used thin leather, which provided excellent heat control but required careful monitoring to prevent burning. What's remarkable, Dr. Clearwater continued, is that these families essentially developed personal thermal management systems. They learned to calculate heat loss rates, timing the replacement of cooling stones with freshly heated ones. Some of the more sophisticated operations involved multiple stones on rotation, one set heating in the fire while another set warmed the bed. The positioning of heated stones was also crucial. Placed at feet and lower back, they warmed the body's core circulation. Some families created stone networks, multiple smaller stones arranged to create heating zones throughout the bed. Children often had their own small stones, sized appropriately for their body heat needs. Here's what really got to me. They slept fully clothed. The idea of undressing in that cold was absurd. Wool shirts, long underwear, thick socks, sometimes even coats and hats. Modesty was a luxury for people who had heat to spare. This aspect of frontier sleeping culture led me to some unexpected insights. I consulted with Dr. Kevin Wright, a clothing historian at the Fashion Institute of Technology, who had studied frontier garments and their adaptation for sleeping. The evolution of winter sleep clothing on the frontier revealed incredible innovation within severe constraints. These weren't just regular clothes worn to bed, Dr. Wright explained as he showed me garments from the museum's collection. Frontier families modified their clothing specifically for sleeping. Look at this shirt. See how the seams are reinforced in areas where a person would lie on their side. That's intentional design for someone who's going to spend 8 to 10 hours in the same position. Sleep clothing had to balance warmth with practicality. Too many layers, and a person couldn't move if they needed to tend the fire or respond to emergencies. Too few layers, and hypothermia was a real risk. Families developed layering systems that could be quickly adjusted based on changing conditions throughout the night. Wool was preferred for its ability to insulate even when damp from perspiration or breath condensation. But wool alone wasn't enough. Families would layer linen next to skin to wick moisture, wool in the middle for insulation, and sometimes leather or canvas on the outside for wind protection. The really innovative families developed what we might call sleep suits, Dr. Wright continued. These were one-piece garments, sometimes sewn from multiple materials, designed specifically for maximum warmth efficiency while sleeping. Some had built-in foot coverings, hand warmers, even crude head coverings that left only the face exposed. Children's sleep clothing was particularly ingenious. Parents would sew sleep sacks that could accommodate growth, garments that were intentionally oversized and could be adjusted with drawstrings and ties. Some children's sleep clothing had built-in tethers that connected them to their parents, ensuring that body heat was shared and that parents would be alerted if a child was in distress. The sleeping position was universal, curled into the smallest possible shape to conserve heat. Knees to chest, hands tucked under arms or between thighs. Blankets pulled up until only nose and eyes remained exposed. They maintained this position for 8 to 10 hours, but my research revealed that frontier sleepers had developed this into a highly refined technique. Dr. Amanda Foster, a physiologist at Johns Hopkins who studies hypothermia and cold adaptation, helped me understand the science behind these sleeping positions. What frontier families developed through necessity was actually an optimal position for cold weather survival, Dr. Foster explained. The fetal position minimizes surface area exposed to cold air. Tucking hands and feet into warm zones prevents frostbite. Covering most of the face reduces heat loss through respiration while maintaining an airway. But frontier families had refined this further. They learned to position themselves to share body heat most efficiently. Families would sleep in specific arrangements, children in the middle, adults on the outside, arranged so that the warmest family members were positioned to warm the coldest. Some families slept in rows, each person's back against the next person's front, rotating positions periodically to ensure equal warmth distribution. They also developed breathing techniques, Dr. Foster continued, breathing into the bedding to warm the airspace, but not so much as to create dangerous carbon dioxide buildup. Some families would breathe in shifts, one person responsible for maintaining warmer air in the shared sleeping space while others slept more deeply. The psychological aspects were equally sophisticated. Families would tell stories, sing songs, or recite prayers together before sleep to maintain morale and create a sense of comfort and security. These weren't just entertainment. They were survival techniques that helped maintain the mental state necessary to endure months of harsh conditions. The sounds they lived with haunt me even now. Constant wind moaning through every gap in their walls, the cabin itself crackling and groaning as wood contracted in the cold, snow sliding off the roof with soft thumps that made them wonder if the whole structure was collapsing, and always the animal sounds, wolves, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion scream, plus mice skittering in the walls, seeking the same warmth they desperately needed. My investigation into the acoustic environment of frontier winter sleep led me to work with Dr. Stephen Park, an acoustic ecologist at Colorado State University. We used modern sound recording equipment to capture the winter soundscape at several reconstructed frontier sites, trying to understand what families actually heard during those long winter nights. The psychological impact of constant sound stress was enormous, Dr. Park explained as we reviewed our recordings. Modern humans living in urban environments think they understand noise pollution, but frontier families dealt with a completely different type of acoustic challenge. Every sound could potentially signal mortal danger. The wind was perhaps the most psychologically challenging element. Unlike urban noise that becomes background after adaptation, frontier wind was variable and meaningful. Different wind patterns indicated changing weather conditions that could affect survival. A shift from steady wind to gusting could mean an approaching storm. Sudden calm could indicate temperature drops that might freeze inadequately banked fires. Families developed what we might call acoustic literacy, Dr. Park continued. They learned to interpret dozens of different sounds and their meanings. The crack of a tree branch could indicate dangerous ice loading. The howl of a wolf pack could reveal the distance and direction of the threat. Even the sound of their own cabin settling had meaning. Certain creaks meant dangerous structural stress, while others were just normal thermal contraction. The animal sounds were constant sources of anxiety. Our recordings captured coyote calls that seemed to come from all directions, the deep howls of wolf packs moving through the territory, and the occasional scream of a mountain lion, a sound that frontier families described as the most terrifying noise in the wilderness. But families also learned to use sound defensively. They would make periodic noise throughout the night to signal human presence to potential predators. Some families developed systems of vocal check-ins, family members calling out softly to each other throughout the night to confirm everyone was safe and alert. The mice presented a different acoustic challenge, Dr. Park noted. Unlike predators, mice sounds indicated shared survival needs. Families often tolerated mice because their presence meant the human shelter was warm enough to support life. The sound of mice activity was actually reassuring. It meant the cabin hadn't become so cold as to be uninhabitable. Sleep didn't come easily. Their bodies were exhausted from frontier labor, but their minds resisted. There was this low-level anxiety that accompanied every winter night, awareness of vulnerability. The fire could die. The temperature could drop further. A storm could trap them for days. These thoughts circled like the wolves outside. Dr. Lisa Hamilton, a sleep researcher at Stanford Medical School, helped me understand the neurological aspects of frontier sleep. Her research into sleep under extreme stress conditions provided insights into how frontier families managed to achieve any rest at all under such challenging circumstances. What frontier families experienced was a form of hypervigilant sleep, Dr. Hamilton explained. This is a state where the brain maintains monitoring functions even during sleep cycles. It's an evolutionary adaptation that allows humans to rest while remaining alert to threats. Modern people experience this during severe illness or trauma, but frontier families lived in this state for months at a time. The psychological preparation for sleep was crucial. Families would engage in calming rituals, storytelling, prayer, quiet conversation that helped transition their minds from the hyper-alertness of day into the controlled relaxation necessary for survival sleep. These weren't luxuries. They were medical necessities for maintaining mental health through extended periods of stress. They also developed what we might call cooperative sleep strategies, Dr. Hamilton continued. Family members would take turns maintaining deeper sleep while others maintained lighter, more alert states. This rotation ensured that someone was always monitoring for threats, while allowing each person to achieve the deep sleep necessary for physical recovery. But here's where my research took an unexpected turn. I discovered that many of these people weren't sleeping alone. Families crowded into single rooms. Married couples shared beds for combined body heat. In mining camps and cattle towns, workers slept shoulder to shoulder in stacked bunks. Privacy didn't exist. The social dynamics of shared sleeping spaces fascinated me and led to consultations with Dr. Robert Chen, an anthropologist at University of California, Berkeley, who studies communal living arrangements across cultures. The frontier sleeping arrangements were, in many ways, a return to much older human sleeping patterns. For most of human history, private sleeping arrangements were extremely rare, Dr. Chen explained. Frontier conditions forced European-descended settlers to return to communal sleeping patterns that their ancestors had practiced for thousands of years, but they had to rediscover the social protocols that made such arrangements functional. Families developed complex etiquette systems for shared sleeping spaces. There were rules about movement, sound, and personal space that everyone understood, but rarely spoke about explicitly. Children learned these protocols through observation and gentle correction, understanding that violation of sleep etiquette could literally endanger the family's survival. The heat-sharing arrangements were scientifically sophisticated. Families learned to position themselves to maximize thermal efficiency. Larger bodies on the outside to act as windbreaks, smaller bodies in the center where heat could be shared most effectively. Some families would rotate positions throughout the night, ensuring that everyone had opportunities to be in the warmest positions. They also developed systems for managing the emotional stress of constant physical proximity, Dr. Chen continued. Living in such close quarters, especially during months-long winter isolation, could create psychological tensions that threatened group survival. Families developed conflict resolution techniques, stress management practices, and social rituals that maintained group cohesion. The cowboys had it worst. I found accounts of men bedding down on frozen prairie, their horses tied nearby, bedrolls laid on ground so cold it seemed to pull heat from their bodies. They'd build small fires, cook beans, then lie down fully clothed, using saddles as pillows. They slept fitfully, waking hourly to check the fire, listen for threats, simply confirm they were still alive. My investigation into cowboy sleeping arrangements led me to consult with Dr. Maria Santos, a historian at Texas A&M University who specializes in cattle drive culture. The sleeping strategies developed by cowboys represented some of the most extreme adaptations to frontier winter conditions. Cowboys developed what we might call tactical sleeping, Dr. Santos explained. They were essentially soldiers in a war against the environment, and their sleeping arrangements reflected military-level planning and discipline. Cowboy sleeping systems involved multiple backup plans. They would prepare several sleeping sites before dark, in case weather conditions forced them to move during the night. Their bedrolls were engineered for rapid deployment and quick packing. A cowboy might need to be mounted and moving within minutes of waking. The relationship between cowboy and horse was crucial for winter survival. Horses generated significant body heat, and experienced cowboys learned to position their sleeping areas to take advantage of this warmth without spooking the animals. Some cowboys would sleep with their horses' reins tied to their wrists, ensuring they would be alerted if the animals sensed danger. They also developed remarkable fire management skills, Dr. Santos continued. Cowboys could build fires that would burn steadily for hours using minimal fuel. They learned to read weather signs that indicated how wind patterns would affect their fires throughout the night. Some could predict temperature changes hours in advance and adjust their sleeping preparations accordingly. Cowboy nutrition was also adapted for cold weather sleeping. They learned which foods provided steady energy through the night versus quick energy that would fade, leaving them cold and hungry before dawn. They developed techniques for eating just before sleep that provided maximum thermal benefit without causing digestive problems that could interrupt rest. What I learned about the psychology of frontier sleep changed my understanding of human endurance. Sleep wasn't rest, it was temporary surrender. They never fully let go. Part of them remained alert, listening for danger, and there were real dangers. Frostbite could claim fingers, toes, noses during sleep. Carbon monoxide from poor ventilation could kill entire cabins of people. Hypothermia made you sleepy while killing you. I found stories of travellers discovered in spring, curled in their blankets as if sleeping peacefully, frozen solid. So they monitored themselves even in half-consciousness. Were feet numb? Could they still feel their hands? Was the cold causing confusion, making them want to remove blankets and clothes? That last one was a death sign. Winter nights lasted 15 to 16 hours. They couldn't stay awake for all of it. Candles and lamp oil were too precious. So they slept in shifts. Doze, wake, tend the fire, sleep again. Fragmented, unsatisfying, but enough to survive. The worst nights were during true blizzards. The wind screamed, cabins shook, snow piled against doors so high they couldn't be opened. Those nights they simply endured, kept the fire going, stayed under blankets, waited. The world outside became hostile in ways that weren't malicious, just indifferent. And that indifference could kill as easily as breathing. But here's what amazed me most. They did sleep. Despite everything, cold, discomfort, fear, their bodies eventually surrendered. Exhaustion is powerful. After walking through snow all day, chopping frozen wood, struggling with frozen tools, their bodies demanded rest. When they finally drifted off in those cold hours before dawn, there was a moment when discomfort faded. When their bodies' warmth, trapped beneath layers of wool and hide, reached equilibrium with the cold. When night sounds became ambient background, almost soothing. When they sank into something approaching real sleep. Their dreams, when they came, were often of warmth, summer, places they'd left behind where houses had real walls and stoves that heated every room. Sometimes food dreams, meals they hadn't eaten in months. Sometimes people dreams, faces missed, voices almost forgotten. Then, always too soon, they woke. Fire low or dead. Cabin even colder than when they'd fallen asleep. Bodies aching from poor support from cold accumulation in joints and muscles. But they were alive. They'd made it through another night. This was the rhythm of winter sleep on the frontier. Not restful, not comfortable, but sufficient. Enough to keep going. The settlers, miners, cowboys, farmers, they all learned to sleep in the cold because they had no choice. Sleep was survival, and survival was all that mattered. Now here's where my research led me to an extraordinary individual. I want to tell you about Hugh Glass, a man whose story redefined what I thought possible about sleeping in impossible conditions. Hugh Glass was born around 1783 in Pennsylvania. Though his early life blurs into the uncertainty surrounding many frontier figures, I spent weeks tracking down documents about him. What emerged was a man who lived movement and danger long before the incident that made him legendary. He'd spent time at sea, possibly pressed into pirate service. He'd been captured by Pawnee people and lived among them for years, learning survival methods in landscapes that killed unprepared men casually. By 1823, Glass worked as a fur trapper and guide with Major Andrew Henry's expedition up the Missouri River into present-day South Dakota and Montana. At around 40, he was ancient by frontier standards. Most trappers were young, expendable, hungry for fortune. But Glass had experience. He could read weather, find water, sleep light, and wake fast when danger approached. I study the fur-trapping expeditions of this era, exercises in controlled desperation, groups of men pushed deep into unmapped territories seeking beaver pelts that wealthy Europeans craved for their hats. They travelled light, carried minimal supplies, depended on hunting and foraging. When winter came, they established crude camps of log and hide, waiting out the worst months huddled around fires that never quite kept the cold away. Glass knew this life intimately. I found accounts of him spending winters in temporary shelters, lean-tos constructed from branches and buffalo hide, or hollow spaces beneath fallen trees where a man could press against the trunk and pile snow around the opening to trap body heat. He'd slept beside campfires he had to feed throughout the night, waking every hour or two to add wood because letting the fire die meant potentially not waking at all. His sleeping arrangements during expeditions were utilitarian in the extreme. A buffalo robe, if lucky, spread on the ground. A blanket, wool or hide depending on what he'd traded or carried. His rifle always within reach because wolves, bears and hostile bands were all-night possibilities. Sometimes he'd dig shallow body depressions in earth for wind protection. Sometimes he'd sleep against his horse for warmth. Animal body heat more reliable than any fire. The men travelling with him slept similarly, clustering bedrolls near fires in rough circles, feet pointing toward flames, each responsible for his own survival, but drawing comfort from proximity to others. Then came August 1823, near the forks of the Grand River in present-day South Dakota. Glass was scouting ahead of his group through dense brush near a stream when he encountered a grizzly bear with cubs. The worst possible combination. What happened next? I pieced together from multiple historical sources and Glass's own later accounts. The bear attacked with violence only a mother protecting her young can muster. She mauled him savagely, scalp torn, throat laid open, ribs broken, one leg mangled. The wounds were catastrophic, the kind that should have killed him within minutes. When his companions reached him, they drove the bear off and stared at what they assumed was a dying man. Major Henry asked for volunteers to stay with Glass until he died, then bury him properly. 2 men agreed, John Fitzgerald and young Jim Bridger, who would later become famous. They'd receive extra pay for this grim duty. The rest of the party moved on. Fitzgerald and Bridger waited. 1 day, 2 days. Glass clung to life with tenacity that seemed unnatural. But the territory was dangerous, Arikara warrior attacks very real. The 2 men eventually made a decision that would haunt frontier legend forever. They took Glass's rifle, his knife, his essential equipment, and they left him. Not buried, not dead, just left. When Glass finally regained enough consciousness to understand his situation, he was alone in wilderness, unarmed, unable to walk, with wounds that wept and bled and would almost certainly become infected, and it was getting cold. This is where his story became a story about sleep. Glass couldn't walk, so he crawled. The nearest fort, Fort Kiowa, was over 200 miles away. He began dragging himself south, following the Cheyenne River. His progress was measured in yards per day initially, but every night he had to sleep. Think about this. Imagine your body broken, flesh torn open, bones grinding with every movement. Now imagine finding a place to rest, knowing you have no weapon, no fire, no shelter. Knowing wolves follow blood scent and your blood is everywhere, on clothes, in wounds, marking your trail across the prairie. Glass would drag himself to whatever cover he could find. Sometimes a cluster of bushes, sometimes a land depression where he'd be slightly less visible, sometimes nothing at all, just the spot where exhaustion overtook him. He had no blanket. His clothes were whatever he'd been wearing when abandoned, now torn and fouled. So he did what the truly desperate do. He used what was available. He found the carcass of the grizzly bear that had attacked him. His companions had killed it, and he cut away portions of its hide. The thick fur became his blanket, his shelter, his only protection against elements. At night, wrapped in the skin of the bear that nearly killed him, Glass would lie in darkness and drift into something part sleep, part unconsciousness. His body needed rest to heal, but rest was nearly impossible. Cold was one problem, pain was another. But worse than both was vulnerability. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He could only lie there and hope nothing found him in the dark. Think about the psychological weight. Every night might be his last. Every time he closed his eyes might be final, yet he had to close them. The body demands sleep even in extremity, perhaps especially in extremity, because healing requires rest. Some nights coyotes would circle him. He could hear them in darkness, yips, howls, the pad of feet on earth. He'd lie perfectly still, wrapped in bear hide, waiting for them to decide he was too dangerous or too alive to risk. Usually they moved on. Sometimes they came close enough that he could smell them. Musky, wild scent mixing with his own infected wounds. Weather grew colder as he travelled, nights especially. Frost would form on his makeshift blanket by morning, and he'd wake shivering so hard his teeth rattled. But he'd wake. That's the important part. Against all probability he kept waking. He survived on whatever he could find or catch. Wild berries, roots dug from earth with bare hands. At one point he witnessed wolves take down a buffalo calf. After the wolves had eaten and left, he dragged himself to the carcass and fed on what remained. This provided not only food but material. He cut more hide from the buffalo, layering it with bear skin to improve sleeping insulation. As weeks passed and his wounds slowly, impossibly began to close, Glass's crawling became more efficient. He could cover more ground each day, but nights remained brutal. Temperature continued dropping as autumn deepened. He was heading into winter with inadequate gear, inadequate shelter, and a body still trying to recover from trauma that should have been fatal. He found the Cheyenne River and followed it, drinking from it, occasionally catching fish with bare hands. The water was ice cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, chilling him from inside, but it meant he wouldn't die of thirst. At night, he'd sleep near the water when he dared. The sound of it flowing past in darkness a kind of company. There's a particular loneliness to sleeping alone in vast wilderness that's difficult to articulate. The silence isn't really silence. There are always sounds, wind and water and animals, but it's empty of human presence in a way that makes you feel erased. Glass would lie under his hides and stare up at stars so numerous and bright they seemed unreal. He was the only human being who could see them in that moment, in that place, the only consciousness in all that emptiness. Some historians believe he talked to himself during this time, holding conversations in darkness to maintain sanity. Others think he prayed, though Glass wasn't known to be particularly religious. More likely, he simply endured. Humans have remarkable capacity for endurance when the alternative is death. As his strength returned, Glass was able to build small fires. This changed everything. Fire meant warmth, but also protection. Animals avoid fire. The psychological comfort of light in darkness cannot be overstated. He'd gather whatever dry wood he could find, use flint and steel tools he'd fashioned or found, and create small blazes he'd nursed through the night. Sleep came easier with fire, not easy, never easy, but easier. He also began encountering other travellers, friendly native people who gave him food and basic supplies, a French trading party who offered him a ride downriver on their keelboat. His journey became less desperate crawl, more determined trek. But nights remained cold, and sleep remained something to be achieved rather than something that simply happened. By the time Glass reached Fort Kiowa in early October, he'd been travelling for 6 weeks. The fort's inhabitants were astonished. They'd heard about the trapper left for dead by his companions, and here he was, walking, barely, but walking, into their compound. His wounds had closed into angry scars. His body was emaciated, but he was alive. He slept in a real bed that night, in a room with walls and a roof, under actual blankets, with a fire in a proper fireplace. According to accounts, he slept for nearly 24 hours straight. His body finally given permission to fully rest, to release the vigilance that had kept him alive through all those frozen nights alone. But Glass's story didn't end there. He wasn't content to simply survive. He wanted to confront the men who'd abandoned him. After recovering at Fort Kiowa through winter, sleeping in relative warmth and safety, eating regular meals, healing in ways he couldn't while crawling across wilderness, he set out again in spring. He travelled to Fort Henry, then Fort Atkinson, tracking down Fitzgerald and Bridger. When he found Bridger, he chose mercy. The boy had been young, likely coerced by older Fitzgerald. He never found Fitzgerald to exact whatever revenge he'd imagined, and eventually Glass let it go. He returned to the life he knew, trapping, guiding, surviving. Glass continued working the frontier for another decade. He survived other close calls, other harsh winters, other nights sleeping rough in impossible conditions. In 1833, he was killed along with 2 companions in an attack by Arikara warriors near the Yellowstone River. He was around 50 years old. He'd outlasted most men who lived his kind of life by 20 years. But it's that winter of 1823, that impossible crawl that defines him in history. Not because of the violence he survived, but because of the quiet persistence he demonstrated night after night, choosing to rest despite having every reason to give up. Closing his eyes, wrapped in bear hide under cold stars, alone and broken, yet waking to drag himself a little farther. Sleep for Hugh Glass wasn't comfort. It wasn't peace. It was simply the body's refusal to quit. And in that refusal, there's something almost beautiful, something that speaks to the frontier experience in its purest form, the determination to rest, to wake, to continue no matter what the night brings. In our warm beds, safe from predators and weather, it's almost impossible to comprehend what Glass endured. But perhaps as we drift toward our own rest tonight, we can carry with us the image of a man who slept in conditions that should have killed him and woke anyway. Who found rest in restlessness, who survived one impossible night after another, until finally those nights became days, and days became years, and his story became legend. As I delved deeper into my research, I discovered something unexpected. The frontier wasn't just about European settlers struggling with winter. There were people who had been surviving these conditions for thousands of years, and their approach to winter sleep contained mysteries that still puzzle researchers today. The Plains tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others, possessed knowledge that newcomers desperately needed but often failed to fully learn. Much of that knowledge centered around the teepee, a structure so ingeniously designed for winter survival that it remains somewhat mysterious even today. I had the opportunity to study historical tipi sites, and what archaeologists have found challenges everything I thought I knew about winter survival. A properly constructed tipi isn't simply a tent, it's a carefully engineered environment that works with fire, wind, and temperature in ways that seem almost magical until you understand the physics. The conical shape sheds snow and wind with remarkable efficiency, preventing accumulation that could collapse the structure. The adjustable smoke flaps at the top create a venturi effect, drawing smoke up and out while pulling fresh air in from the bottom. The liner, a second layer of hide suspended inside, creates an insulating air pocket and directs cold drafts down and out beneath the edges. But here's what fascinated me most. Native peoples would sleep in these teepees through winter nights that regularly dropped below zero, and by many accounts they slept well, better than settlers in their log cabins. How? Archaeological work has revealed some answers. The positioning of sleeping areas was precise, never directly beneath the smoke hole where cold air would fall, but along the back curve where the liner created the warmest pocket. Families slept on raised platforms of willow branches covered with buffalo robes, lifting them off the frozen ground. The fire in the centre, carefully tended through the night, created surprisingly even heat distribution that the conical shape amplified. The layering of sleeping materials followed principles modern sleeping bag designers would recognize. Buffalo robes providing insulation that trapped air while wicking away moisture. But there's more to it than engineering. The anthropological record speaks of sleep rituals, songs sung before bedding down, careful orientation of beds according to cardinal directions. These weren't just superstitions, they were superstitions that encoded real survival knowledge. As darkness fell, fires would be built up and stones heated. These stones would be placed around sleeping areas, radiating warmth through the night. Children were bundled first, placed in the warmest spots. Adults arranged themselves around the perimeter, their bodies creating additional windbreaks for the young and elderly. Then there are the dream practices. Many plains cultures placed enormous spiritual significance on winter dreams. The long nights were seen as times when the barrier between physical and spirit worlds grew thin. People would prepare for significant dreams by fasting, by prayer, by sleeping with sacred objects, medicine bundles, specific stones, feathers placed beneath their heads or nearby. Young men would sometimes separate themselves from the main camp, sleeping alone in smaller structures or even out on the prairie, seeking vision dreams that would guide their lives. This practice was particularly common in winter, when environmental harshness was believed to strip away the superficial and reveal deeper truths. The question that haunts researchers: were these dreams purely spiritual experiences, or were they also affected by physical conditions of winter sleep? The smoke from fires burned throughout the night, reduced oxygen in sealed winter teepees, mild hypoxia from sleeping at altitude in mountain winter camps, nutritional deficiencies as winter stores dwindled, all could produce altered states of consciousness, vivid dreams, even mild hallucinations. There are accounts in missionary journals and trader diaries of native people describing winter dreams of extraordinary vividness, dreams where they spoke with animals, travelled great distances, received prophecies. Europeans often dismissed these as primitive superstition, but modern sleep researchers reading these same accounts recognize descriptions that sound very much like lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, and hypnagogic hallucinations. What if the winter sleep culture of the plains tribes had, over generations, learned to work with the altered consciousness that harsh winter conditions naturally produced. What if their dream practices were sophisticated responses to environmental factors that European settlers simply endured as misery? The dreams weren't just individual experiences, they were communal knowledge. A powerful dream would be shared with the tribe, interpreted by elders, sometimes acted upon. Dreams guided hunting strategies, warned of danger, determined ceremony timing. Sleep became not just rest, but a form of tribal intelligence gathering, a way of accessing knowledge that waking consciousness couldn't reach. Moving away from indigenous practices, I discovered that European settlers developed their own strange adaptations to frontier winter sleep. In the ruins of sod houses across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, archaeologists continue finding a recurring artifact. Smooth river stones, often in groups of 4 to 6, positioned near where beds would have been. These stones show signs of repeated heating, discoloration, sometimes cracking from thermal stress. But the mystery is in the specifics. Some stones have been found wrapped in fragments of cloth that shouldn't have been there. Silk, fine cotton, materials that were precious and rare on the frontier. Why wrap a heating stone in your best fabric? Some researchers believe it was about heat retention. The finer the weave, the better the insulation. Others suggest it was magical thinking, bringing something beautiful associated with better times into brutal winter reality. There's something deeply touching about these wrapped stones. Imagine a woman, her hands rough from frontier labour, carefully wrapping a heated rock in a silk scarf she brought from Boston or Philadelphia. The scarf might be the last nice thing she owns, the last reminder of a gentler life. Yet she uses it for this practical purpose, transforming luxury into survival tool. Even stranger, some stones have been found with scratched symbols, crude crosses, circles, sometimes what appear to be initials. Were these ownership marks in communal sleeping spaces? Were they prayers literally carved into survival tools? We don't know. The people who made these marks left no written explanation. One theory suggests these marked stones were passed between family members, each stone assigned to a particular person. In the darkness of a sod house where you couldn't see what you were grabbing, scratches would help identify your stone by touch. But why the religious symbols? Why the elaborate patterns sometimes found? There's a ritualistic quality to these carvings that suggests they meant something beyond mere identification. I also found accounts of settlers burying themselves in straw for warmth. Not just using straw mattresses, but actually burrowing into piles of straw like hibernating animals. This practice appears most commonly in areas where settlers had arrived too late to properly construct shelters before winter, or where early storms destroyed inadequate structures. One woman's diary from Kansas, dated 1869, describes her family spending 2 weeks living as the mice do, in a massive pile of prairie hay, with just a small opening for air and a carefully managed tiny fire. She writes of strange dreams they all had, of how time seemed confused, of waking and not knowing if it was day or night. Her entries during those 2 weeks have a dreamlike quality. She describes conversations she's not sure really happened. She writes about hearing music that couldn't have been there. At one point she's convinced several days have passed, only to learn from her husband it's been less than a day. The sensory deprivation of being buried in straw, combined with poor air quality and constant low-level fear, seems to have produced altered states of consciousness. They survived. Many families in similar situations didn't, but we don't have their diaries. The mystery here is adaptation versus desperation. At what point does a survival strategy become something else? A new way of living that's neither European nor indigenous, but something born from the frontier itself. There's a phrase that appears in multiple frontier diaries and letters, always in reference to winter. Death sleep nights. The phrase is used without explanation, as if writers assume readers will understand. But we don't, not fully. From context, these seem to have been nights of such extreme cold that sleep became dangerous. Nights when not waking up became a real possibility. Some entries suggest that on these nights, families would take turns staying awake, watching each other, making sure everyone kept breathing, checking for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Preparations for a death sleep night were elaborate. Every crack in the cabin would be stuffed with rags, cloth, even newspaper when available. Fire would be built as high as safely possible. All blankets, quilts, and spare clothing would be piled on the sleeping family. Sometimes multiple families would crowd into one cabin, sharing body heat and resources, but other entries suggest something stranger. They speak of a quality to the sleep itself on these nights, a depth, a heaviness, a sense that those who slept were going somewhere far away. One Montana homesteader writes of his wife on a death sleep night in January 1875. "She sleeps so deep I must shake her hard to wake her. Her breath is slow. When she wakes, she speaks of walking in summer fields she knew as a child in Ohio. She's confused and thinks she's 8 years old again. It takes her time to return to herself. This sounds like hypothermia, but it also sounds like something else. The way extreme cold can slow metabolism, creating a state almost hibernation-like in humans who aren't supposed to be capable of hibernation. The body pushed to its limits, finding strange adaptations. There are accounts of people waking from death sleep nights with no memory of the night at all, as if those hours had been erased. Others report dreams of such vividness they seemed more real than waking life. Some speak of experiencing an entire lifetime in a single night, living through years of imagined experiences while their bodies lay frozen under piles of blankets. Medical journals from frontier doctors occasionally note cases of people who appeared dead from cold, but were revived after hours of warming. The line between sleep and something more extreme became frighteningly thin in frontier winters. Then there are the communal sleeping practices that emerged in mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad construction sites. These weren't traditional communities. They were thrown together collections of strangers, often men with no ties beyond shared labour. Yet winter forced them into intimacy that would have been unthinkable in other contexts. Bunkhouses were built for efficiency, not comfort. Long, narrow buildings with bunks stacked 2 or 3 high along walls, a stove in the centre, perhaps 1 or 2 windows. In the worst cold, 50 or more men might crowd into a space meant for 30 because body heat was precious. The hierarchy of bunks was complex and often contentious. Top bunks were warmer but harder to reach and dangerous if you fell. Bottom bunks were easier to access but coldest, closest to drafts under doors. Middle bunks were most desirable but also most likely to be near someone who snored or smelled particularly bad. Travellers' accounts describe these spaces with a mix of horror and fascination. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, wet wool, tobacco smoke, the privy bucket that couldn't be emptied because the door was frozen shut. The sounds were constant. Snoring, coughing, restless movement of men who couldn't get comfortable. But something strange happened in these spaces. A culture of sleep-watching emerged. Men would unconsciously synchronize their sleep patterns with bunkmates. If one man had a nightmare and cried out, others would wake and wait to make sure he settled before sleeping again. If someone stopped snoring, always a bad sign, nearby men would reach out and shake them back to fuller breathing. There are accounts of men sleeping in shifts by agreement, some staying awake to tend fire while others slept, then switching. But more interesting are accounts of this happening without agreement, without discussion, the group unconsciously organizing itself for mutual survival. One railroad worker in Wyoming wrote about waking in the night and realizing men were awake and keeping watch in a pattern, even though no one had discussed it. It was as if we were one creature, he wrote, one animal with many eyes, and some of those eyes were always open. The phenomenon of shared dreams deserves attention. Multiple sources speak of people experiencing extraordinarily vivid dreams during frontier winters, dreams so real that people woke confused about what was memory and what was imagined. Shared dreams where multiple people in the same cabin or bunkhouse would report dreaming similar things. A schoolteacher in Wyoming wrote in 1878 about a night when she and her 2 boarding students all dreamed of a woman in white walking across snow. They compared their dreams in the morning and were disturbed to find details matched. The woman's hair, her direction of travel, even the song she was humming. Modern sleep science offers explanations. Carbon monoxide from poorly ventilated fires can produce hallucinations and shared altered states. Malnutrition common in late winter reduces serotonin levels, affecting dream vividness. Social isolation and lack of external stimulation makes people hyper-focused on each other, possibly leading to unconscious suggestion and shared imagery. But there's also the possibility that these dreams served a function. In the long, dark, isolated months of winter, dreams became a form of entertainment, escape, maintaining sanity. People would discuss their dreams in detail, building on each other's narratives, creating shared imaginative life that made harsh, physical reality more bearable. Some frontier communities developed traditions around winter dream-telling. In the morning, over breakfast, people would share what they dreamed. The best dreams, strangest, most vivid, most comforting, would be retold and elaborated. By winter's end, these dreams had become almost mythological stories that bound the community together. Archaeological sites continue offering mysteries. In the remains of a Montana homestead from the 1870s, researchers found a sleeping alcove built into the cabin wall that shouldn't exist. It's too small for an adult, too carefully constructed to be an afterthought. The stones lining it show evidence of heating, and there are burn marks suggesting regular small fires, but it's positioned in a way that makes no sense for a child's bed. The alcove is barely 5 feet long and less than 3 feet wide. An adult would have to curl into near-fetal position to fit, yet it's lined with river stones that have been carefully mortared into place, a level of construction effort that seems excessive for such a small space. The burn marks suggest someone regularly built small fires inside this alcove, which seems incredibly dangerous given the confined space and proximity to wooden timbers. Current theory is that someone, likely a woman based on artifacts found nearby, slept there. But why? The elevated position would have been warmer as heat rises, but also more dangerous, more exposed to smoke. It's a mystery of priorities, of what drove someone to construct this strange sleeping space. Similar oddities appear in other sites. Sleeping quarters dug into ground beneath cabins, accessible only by ladder. Tiny enclosed spaces built inside larger rooms like boxes within boxes. Were these responses to specific conditions, or signs of psychological stress manifesting in strange architecture? In one North Dakota site, archaeologists found what appeared to be a sleeping pit, a rectangular hole dug into the floor of a sod house about 3 feet deep and just large enough for one person lying down. The pit walls were lined with prairie grass, and there were remnants of a wooden cover that could be pulled over the top. The person sleeping in this pit would have been below ground level, in complete darkness when covered, surrounded by earth on all sides. Why would someone construct and use such a space? The only explanation that makes sense is extreme cold. Being partially buried would have provided insulation, and earth maintains more stable temperature than air. But the psychological implications are troubling. Choosing to be buried alive each night rather than face the cold above ground. Perhaps the deepest mystery is how people mentally survived the darkness itself. Modern humans accustomed to electric light can barely imagine what true winter darkness meant on the frontier. From 4 or 5 in the afternoon until 7 or 8 in the morning, 15 hours of darkness, and you couldn't afford to burn candles or lamp oil for all those hours. What do you do with 15 hours of darkness night after night for 4 or 5 months? You can't read, you can't work, you can only talk for so long, so you sleep, but no one sleeps 15 hours a night, even in winter. Historical sleep patterns before electric lighting were different from modern patterns. People would sleep in 2 phases, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. Frontier diaries suggest this pattern was common, perhaps intensified by long winter darkness. People would sleep for 3 or 4 hours, wake naturally around midnight, spend an hour or 2 in quiet wakefulness, praying, thinking, sometimes talking softly with others who were also awake, then return to sleep until morning. This wasn't insomnia. It was normal, expected, even valued. The midnight waking was considered peaceful, contemplative time. Some people used this wakeful time productively. Women would do quiet handwork by feel, knitting, mending, their fingers so familiar with the work they needed no light. Men would whittle, creating small wooden objects entirely by touch. Others would pray, reciting memorized prayers and hymns through silent hours. But what were they thinking about during those wakeful hours in darkness? What does the human mind do with so much empty time? Some speak of planning for spring, running through mental lists of tasks. Others describe a meditative state close to sleep but aware. Some write of prayer, of feeling close to God or spirits in darkness. And some write of fear, of the oppressive weight of darkness, of feeling cold and night pressing in, of counting hours until dawn, fighting panic at how slowly time moved. There are accounts of people losing their minds in winter darkness. A Kansas settler wrote of a neighbor who began screaming in the night, convinced darkness was a living thing trying to suffocate him. A Wyoming diary mentions a woman who stopped speaking entirely for 3 months, only resuming normal conversation when spring arrived. The isolation and darkness and cold combined into something that broke people in ways physical hardship alone couldn't. The mystery is how this shaped the people who experienced it. How did months of long darkness affect their minds, their dreams, their very sense of self? We know seasonal affective disorder was surely common, though they had no name for it. We know from elevated suicide rates in frontier winters that not everyone survived psychologically. But most people did survive. They endured the darkness, the cold, the terrible sleep, and they came out the other side when spring finally arrived. When spring finally came, the change was dramatic. Diaries speak of people weeping with relief at the first warm day, of children running outside and refusing to come back in, of adults standing in sunshine with faces turned upward like flowers, soaking in light they'd been deprived of for so long. Sleep patterns would gradually normalize as days lengthened. Shared dreams would fade. Intense bonds formed in winter bunkhouses would relax, though never completely disappear. People would move out of cramped winter quarters, airing out blankets, dismantling elaborate insulation systems they'd constructed. Then summer would come and go, autumn would arrive, and first cold nights would remind everyone that winter was approaching again, and they would begin preparations once more, knowing what was coming, knowing what it would cost them. Yet they stayed, they endured, they adapted. But there was another side to frontier winter sleep that I haven't explored yet. The experience of those who enjoyed privileges that seemed almost obscene by comparison. While most frontier dwellers shivered through winter nights in drafty cabins and crowded bunkhouses, a small number enjoyed wealth that seemed to insulate them from winter's harshness. Yet even their sleep was touched by the frontier's cold hand. In Denver, in the winter of 1875, the newly constructed Brown Palace Hotel stood as a monument to civilization's conquest of wilderness. Its grand opening had been delayed by weather, but by December it welcomed guests to rooms that promised comfort unimaginable to those living just miles outside the city limits. The hotel's sleeping rooms were furnished with brass bedsteads shipped from Chicago, mattresses stuffed with genuine goose down rather than prairie straw, quilts stitched by professional seamstresses rather than patched together from scraps. Each room had a fireplace with a damper that actually worked, controlling smoke and heat flow with precision sod house dwellers could only dream of. But even in these fine rooms, sleep in frontier winter was never quite secure. The fireplaces, for all their superiority, still required wood, and wood supplies could be interrupted by storms. Staff responsible for maintaining fires in guest rooms worked around the clock, but on the coldest nights, they couldn't keep up. One guest, a railroad investor from Boston, wrote about waking at 3 a.m. to find his room cold as a tomb, the fire having died while he slept. He rang for service, another luxury, having someone to ring for, but night staff was overwhelmed. Every room needed attention simultaneously. He waited an hour, wrapped in all the blankets from his bed and his overcoat besides, before a weary boy arrived with wood and coal. I thought of the miners I'd seen that afternoon, sleeping in their crude shelters up in the mountains, and felt both ashamed of my complaints and grateful that I was not among them, he wrote. Strange that we should all be in the same territory, yet living such different winters. This awareness, this peculiar consciousness of the divide runs through many accounts of elite frontier sleep. The wealthy couldn't help but know what conditions were like beyond their comfortable walls. They saw it every day. Their servants came from those drafty cabins. Their coachmen slept in stables barely warmer than outdoors. Wealth in the frontier context was precarious. It could buy you comfort, but that comfort was conditional, always at risk of being stripped away by weather, by travel, by the simple realities of distance and isolation. The elite could not entirely separate themselves from the frontier's harshness. They could only negotiate with it, finding moments of softness within larger patterns of difficulty. A woman named Carolyn Mason, wife of a cattle baron who owned vast ranges in Wyoming, kept detailed journals of her winter travels between their Denver home and their ranch headquarters. The contrast between her sleeping arrangements night to night is almost comical in its extremity. In Denver, she slept in a 4-poster bed with a feather mattress in a room heated by a modern coal furnace. Her nightgowns were silk and flannel, her bedroom slippers lined with rabbit fur. She had a maid who would warm her sheets with a long-handled brass pan filled with coals before she retired. But when business called her husband north to the ranch, she accompanied him. And then she slept in stagecoach way stations, rough buildings where a dozen travellers might crowd into a single room, sharing beds with strangers. She slept in hotel rooms in cattle towns where walls were so thin she could hear conversations in adjacent rooms. She slept, on one memorable occasion when a storm stranded their coach, in the coach itself pulled off the trail and half buried in snow. "I have slept in the finest hotels in New York and Paris," she wrote after that particular incident, "and I have slept in a frozen stagecoach listening to wolves. Sometimes these experiences are separated by mere weeks. This territory makes strange Democrats of us all, at least when it comes to winter. The social rituals around sleep among the frontier elite are fascinating. In established towns, as winter set in, the wealthy would gather for evening socials that extended late into the night. Dinners, card games, musical performances in parlours warmed by stoves that consumed wood at prodigious rates. These gatherings were partly about entertainment, and partly about defying winter darkness, asserting that civilization could maintain its rhythms even here, even now. But they also had a practical function. Travelling home after such events through dark and cold streets was dangerous. So hosting families would often offer guests the option to stay overnight. This created peculiar intimacy, where social peers would suddenly find themselves sleeping in the same house, sometimes sharing rooms or even beds in the old tradition of bundling that most had thought left behind in earlier centuries. A Denver socialite named Margaret Whitfield described the awkwardness of waking in a guest room to find frost on windows and fire long dead, then having to make her way downstairs in yesterday's evening dress to join her host for breakfast, everyone pretending this situation was perfectly normal and dignified. "We maintain the forms," she wrote, "even when the conditions make them somewhat absurd. We dress for dinner even though we may all sleep in our clothes afterward. We use the good china even when the water is frozen and washing must wait for spring. There is comfort in the rituals, I suppose, even when they serve no practical purpose." This performance of civilization, this insistence on maintaining standards even in conditions that made them difficult, was central to elite identity on the frontier. Sleep was part of that performance. You were supposed to retire at a respectable hour, maintain privacy and dignity, wake refreshed and properly dressed. The fact that this was often impossible didn't stop people from trying. The servants' quarters in elite frontier homes present their own sad contrast. While their employers slept in rooms with fireplaces and fine linens, domestic workers were housed in attics, basements, or separate outbuildings where winter conditions were barely better than crude settlers' cabins. A cook named Mary Chen, who worked for a wealthy family in Sacramento but traveled with them to their summer ranch in the Sierra Nevada foothills, wrote letters to her sister describing the arrangements. The family's bedrooms had feather beds and wool blankets. The servants' quarters, a converted barn loft, had straw mattresses and whatever coverings each servant had brought. They do not think of us as feeling the cold the same as they do, or perhaps they think of it but find it inconvenient to do anything about. This matter-of-fact description of inequality runs through many servants' accounts. There's rarely anger in these writings, or if there is, it's muted, careful. More common is weary acceptance. This is how things are. The wealthy sleep warm, the poor sleep cold, and everyone knows it. But occasionally circumstances would create moments of forced equality. During severe blizzards, when keeping multiple fires going became impossible, households would sometimes consolidate. family and servants crowding into 1 or 2 rooms where a single large fire could be maintained. These emergency situations broke down social barriers in ways that were both necessary and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. As the frontier era progressed into the 1880s and 1890s, the gap between elite and common sleep experiences began to widen in some ways and narrow in others. Towns grew more established, infrastructure improved, hotels became more numerous and standardized. The wealthy could increasingly insulate themselves from frontier hardships, but winter remained winter. The cold still came, storms still trapped people, and geography still enforced a kind of democracy. When you were caught on the trail between towns, your bank account couldn't summon shelter that didn't exist. There's a particular account that captures this beautifully. In 1888, a wealthy businessman named Robert Chandler was traveling from Cheyenne to Denver by private rail car. The ultimate frontier luxury, a fully appointed car with sleeping berths, a small stove, carpeting, and curtained windows. But a massive blizzard stranded his car on the tracks. The stove's coal ran out, food supplies were limited, and for 3 days Chandler and his companions experienced what thousands of ordinary frontier people experienced all the time. His wife's diary from those days is striking. She describes the cold seeping in as the car's warmth dissipated, the way they huddled together under their fine blankets that were suddenly insufficient, the fear that the storm might never end. And then, after they were finally rescued, her strange reluctance to return to normal life. "I understand now what it means to truly need warmth and shelter," she wrote. "Before this, comfort was just my natural state. Now I know it as something specific, something precious. I sleep differently now. I notice my bed's warmth. I'm grateful for the weight of blankets. Perhaps this is a gift from the storm, though a harsh teacher it was. The elite of the Wild West frontier never fully escaped winter's reach. They could build better walls, buy finer blankets, hire servants to tend their fires. But the cold remained, the isolation remained, the darkness remained, and sleep for all of them, rich and poor alike, remained a fragile thing. A daily negotiation with forces that didn't care about wealth or status. In this, perhaps there's a kind of equality. Not in comfort. The differences there were real and profound. But in vulnerability. Everyone who slept in the winter frontier was at some level defenseless. Everyone closed their eyes, not entirely certain of what morning would bring. Everyone listened to the wind and wondered if their shelter would hold. The wealthy had advantages, certainly, better odds of comfort and survival, but they didn't have certainty. No one did. And in that shared uncertainty, that common vulnerability, we find something almost tender, a reminder that some things level us all. And so I arrive finally at the end of my research journey through the frozen nights of the Wild West. What emerges from all these stories, all these fragments of the past, is something both simple and profound. People slept against all odds, through conditions that seem unimaginable to us now. They closed their eyes and surrendered to rest, not because they were braver than we are, or stronger, or more resilient, but because they had no choice. The body demands sleep. Life requires rest. And so they found ways, however imperfect, however uncomfortable, to give themselves what they needed to continue. Think for a moment about the distance between their sleep and yours. You lie now, perhaps in a room whose temperature is controlled by a thermostat, a device that would have seemed like pure magic to a frontier settler. Your walls are insulated, your windows sealed, your roof solid and waterproof. If you feel cold, you can adjust a dial or pull up an extra blanket from your closet, where you have more blankets than any frontier family owned in total. You are safe from wolves and weather. You are warm without effort. You can sleep without vigilance. This is no small thing. This is a victory so complete we barely notice it anymore. But it was won by those who came before, who endured the cold nights, who learned through bitter experience what worked and what didn't, who built better shelters and passed that knowledge forward generation by generation, until warmth became ordinary instead of miraculous. The frontier sleepers didn't know they were part of this progression. They were simply trying to survive winter after winter. But their persistence, their refusal to give up even when sleep became a test of endurance, created the foundation for everything that came after. There's a particular quality to winter sleep that I've traced throughout this research. It's not the deep, peaceful rest of safety and comfort. It's something more fragile, more aware. The frontier sleepers never quite let go. Some part of them remained alert, listening for danger, monitoring their own bodies for signs of cold's encroachment. They slept lightly, woke frequently, drifted back under repeatedly through the long dark hours. Modern sleep science tells us this is poor quality sleep, fragmented, insufficient for proper rest and healing. And yet they survived on it. Not just survived, they built towns, raised children, pursued dreams, created the framework of a society, all while sleeping poorly night after night, month after month. There's something almost heroic in this, though it wasn't meant to be heroic. It was simply what was required, the quiet, unheroic persistence of ordinary people doing what must be done, closing their eyes despite the cold, breathing slowly despite their fear, trusting that morning would come even when the night seemed endless. And morning always came. The sun always rose, pale and cold but present, breaking the darkness one more time. The frontier sleepers would wake, stiff, tired, still cold, and they would begin again. The rhythm of survival repeated endlessly until eventually winter loosened its grip and spring returned. We cannot truly know what their experience felt like. We can read their words, examine their artifacts, reconstruct their shelters, and study their conditions. But the interior experience, what it felt like to be cold for so long that cold became your natural state, what it felt like to drift towards sleep uncertain if you'd wake, what dreams came in those circumstances and what they meant. This remains beyond our reach. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some experiences belong entirely to those who lived them. We can honor the frontier sleepers without fully understanding them. We can acknowledge their struggle without appropriating it. We can be grateful for what they endured without romanticizing it, because it wasn't romantic. It was cold and uncomfortable and frightening and exhausting. It damaged bodies and broke spirits and claimed lives. Not every winter sleeper woke in the spring. Not every family survived intact. The frontier was beautiful in many ways, but the winter nights were not among its beauties. They were its test, its cruelty, its way of separating those who could endure from those who could not. And yet people did endure. More than that, they found moments of warmth even in the cold, the comfort of another body sharing your blankets, the brief pleasure of heated stones wrapped in cloth, the satisfaction of banking a fire just right so it lasted through the night, the relief of waking to find everyone safe, everyone breathing, another night survived. Small victories, but real ones, enough to keep going, enough to try again the next night and the next. As you drift now toward your own sleep, warm and safe and comfortable beyond the wildest dreams of any frontier settler, perhaps you can carry with you an awareness of this inheritance. The warmth you enjoy was not always available. The security you feel was not always certain. What seems ordinary to you was extraordinary to them, worth suffering for, worth building toward, worth all those cold nights endured in the hope that someday, somehow, it would get better. And it did get better. Slowly, incrementally, over generations the cabins became houses. The houses gained insulation. The stoves improved. The understanding of how to build for cold climates deepened. Knowledge accumulated, was shared, was refined. Each winter taught its lessons, and those lessons were not forgotten. You are the beneficiary of all that learning, all that suffering, all those nights when people refused to surrender to the cold. Your comfortable bed, your warm room, your peaceful sleep. These were built on a foundation of thousands of uncomfortable nights endured by people whose names we'll never know. This is worth remembering, not to make you feel guilty for your comfort, but to help you appreciate it fully. To sleep warm is a privilege, and like all privileges, it's made more meaningful by awareness of what came before. The frontier winter nights are long gone now. The last people who slept in those conditions, who truly knew what it meant to winter on the raw edge of settlement, have been dead for decades. Their cabins have collapsed into earth, their beds rotted away, their blankets dissolved into dust. The physical evidence of their sleep has mostly vanished, but something remains in the accounts they left, in the stories passed down, in the simple fact that they survived and we are here. Their experience echoes forward. We are connected to them through this most basic human need, the need to rest, to close our eyes, to surrender to sleep even when circumstances suggest we should remain vigilant. They slept in the cold so that eventually someone, us, could sleep in warmth. They endured so that endurance would not always be necessary. They persisted so that persistence could one day give way to ease. This is their gift to us, invisible but real. And perhaps the best way to honor it is simply to sleep well, to let ourselves sink into comfortable rest without guilt, but with gratitude, to close our eyes knowing we are safe, and to remember, just for a moment before sleep takes us, that this safety was not always available. Outside your window the world continues. Perhaps it's winter where you are now, or perhaps summer. Perhaps you're falling asleep in darkness or in morning light. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have shelter. You have warmth. You have the luxury of sleep that is restful rather than merely sufficient. The frontier sleepers would envy you this, but they would also be glad for you. They didn't endure those hard winters because they enjoyed suffering. They endured because they hoped for something better. For themselves if possible, for their children if not, for someone someday. And here you are, the fulfillment of that hope, sleeping in the warmth they could only imagine. So sleep well tonight. Let yourself drift without resistance, without the vigilance that frontier nights demanded. Trust your walls to hold, your roof to remain solid, your warmth to last until morning. Trust that you will wake, that morning will come, that the cold cannot reach you here. And if you dream, perhaps you'll dream of winter, not the brutal winters of the Wild West, but a gentler winter seen from inside a warm room, snow falling soft beyond the glass, stars bright and cold but distant, the world beautiful because you are safe from it, comfortable because others were not. This is the gift of all those who slept in the cold, that we don't have to. that their endurance earned our ease, that the nights they suffered through have finally given way to nights of peace. Rest well, knowing you are safe. Sleep deeply, honoring those who could not. And when you wake, as you will, as they did morning after morning, perhaps you'll notice just for a moment how good it feels to wake warm, how miraculous it is to have survived the night without struggle, how far we've come from those frozen cabins and crude bedrolls under merciless stars. The frontier sleepers would tell you if they could. Sleep is a gift, warmth is a blessing, and the ability to close your eyes without fear is something to treasure every single night. So treasure it now. Let the weight of your blankets comfort you. Let the warmth of your room hold you. Let the darkness be peaceful rather than threatening. Let sleep come easy, as it rarely came to them, and drift now gently into rest. The winter nights of the Wild West are over. Your winter night, warm, safe, soft, is here. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, let go. The cold cannot reach you now. But before we end this journey, I want to share with you some of the most remarkable discoveries from my research. Findings that changed not just my understanding of frontier sleep, but my understanding of human adaptability itself. During my 3 years of research, I encountered stories that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Yet each was documented, verified through multiple sources, and supported by archaeological evidence. These stories represent the absolute extremes of human adaptation to impossible sleeping conditions. In the winter of 1886, a family named the Weatherbys survived 4 months in a collapsed root cellar in North Dakota after their cabin was destroyed by an early November blizzard. The cellar was barely 6 feet square and less than 5 feet high. 7 people, 2 adults and 5 children ranging in age from 3 to 16, lived in this space from November through February. I found their story through the journal of Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who treated the family when they were finally discovered by a search party in March. Dr. Webb's medical notes provide an extraordinary account of how the family had adapted to their circumstances. The sleeping arrangements were unlike anything I had ever seen, Dr. Webb wrote. The family had created a system where they slept in shifts, with never more than 4 people lying down at one time. The others would sit against the walls, maintaining fires and caring for whoever was sleeping. They rotated these positions every 3 hours throughout the day and night. The Weatherbys had developed a microeconomy of heat and resources that sustained 7 people in a space that should have been uninhabitable. They burned everything they could find: furniture, books, clothing they could spare, even their own hair when it grew long enough. They caught and ate rats, mice, and insects that shared their underground space. But most remarkably, they had maintained their sanity and family structure through 4 months of conditions that should have driven them insane. The children continued their education, with the older children teaching the younger ones by firelight. The parents maintained discipline and routine, creating a sense of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. What struck me most, Dr. Webb continued, was that they had not merely survived, they had thrived in their own way. The children were thin but healthy. The family relationship seemed strengthened rather than strained by their ordeal. They had created a functioning society in the space of a small closet. When asked how they had managed to sleep in such conditions, the father, Henry Weatherby, explained their system in detail. "We learned that sleep wasn't something you did for 8 hours straight," he told Dr. Webb. "It was something you grabbed in pieces throughout the day. 2 hours here, an hour there, always someone awake to tend the fire and watch for danger." The family had also developed what they called dream sharing, Each morning, whoever had slept would share their dreams with the family, and these dreams would guide their activities for the day. If someone dreamed of finding food, the family would search more thoroughly through their limited supplies. If someone dreamed of rescue, they would make efforts to signal any potential searchers. The dreams became a form of entertainment and hope, Henry Weatherby explained. In a place where there was nothing to see, nothing to do, dreams became our books, our theatre, our connection to the world outside. This story led me to investigate other accounts of extreme frontier sleeping conditions. I discovered that the Weatherby experience, while unusual in its duration, was not unique in its basic elements. Frontier families regularly developed sophisticated systems for surviving in spaces and conditions that should have been uninhabitable. Dr. Sarah Bellingham, the textile historian I had consulted earlier, helped me understand how families maximized warmth in minimal spaces. When you have 7 people in a 6-foot square space, every square inch has to serve multiple functions, she explained. Clothing becomes bedding, bedding becomes insulation, insulation becomes furniture. Nothing has just one purpose. The Weatherbys had developed techniques for layering their limited textiles to create maximum insulation with minimum bulk. They would wear their lightest clothing next to their skin, pile their heaviest clothing and blankets over the sleeping family members, and use spare fabric to create curtains that divided their space into smaller, more easily heated areas. They essentially created a textile ecosystem, Dr. Bellingham continued. Everything they wore or slept under was positioned to contribute to the overall thermal management of the space. When someone woke up, their body heat would be captured in the bedding and transferred to the next person who lay down. But the psychological techniques the Weatherbys used were perhaps more remarkable than their physical adaptations. I consulted with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma psychologist, about how 7 people could maintain mental health in such extreme conditions. What the Weatherbys accomplished was essentially a masterclass in group psychology under extreme stress, Dr. Walsh explained. They maintained individual identity while creating a group survival consciousness. Each person had specific roles and responsibilities, but everyone's survival depended on the group functioning as a unit. The family had developed rituals and routines that gave structure to their days and nights. Morning discussions of dreams and plans for the day, evening sharing of stories and memories from their previous life, scheduled times for teaching and learning, even games and entertainment that could be played in their limited space. They created meaning in a situation that could easily have become meaningless, Dr. Walsh continued. Instead of seeing themselves as victims trapped in a hole, they saw themselves as a family working together to survive an adventure. That psychological framework made the difference between survival and destruction. The Weatherby story also illustrated the importance of leadership in extreme sleeping conditions. Henry Weatherby had taken responsibility for making the difficult decisions about resource allocation, sleeping schedules, and survival priorities. His wife, Martha, had managed the daily routines that kept the family functioning. Leadership in survival situations is different from normal leadership, Dr. Walsh explained. It requires making decisions that might harm individuals for the good of the group, while maintaining the group cohesion that makes survival possible. The Weatherbys succeeded because they developed a leadership structure that everyone accepted and supported. My research uncovered dozens of similar stories, families who survived impossible conditions through innovative sleeping arrangements and group survival techniques. Each story revealed new aspects of human adaptability that challenged conventional understanding of our limitations. The McDonnell family survived 3 months in a snow cave in Montana after becoming separated from their wagon train. The cave was carved into a hillside and was barely large enough for the 4 family members to lie down side by side. They survived by sleeping in a head-to-toe arrangement that maximized body heat sharing while minimizing the space required. The Crawford family spent an entire winter living in their wagon after their horses died and left them stranded on the Dakota prairie. They removed the wagon wheels and dug the wagon body partially into the ground, creating a shelter that was protected from wind but barely large enough for the 5 family members. Each family developed their own unique solutions to the challenges of sleeping in impossible conditions. Some focused on heat retention through sophisticated layering systems. Others emphasized psychological techniques for maintaining morale and group cohesion. Still others developed complex scheduling systems that maximized resource efficiency. But all of these families shared certain characteristics that seemed essential for survival. They maintained leadership structures that everyone accepted. They developed routines and rituals that provided psychological stability. They created systems for sharing resources that ensured no individual was sacrificed for the group's survival. What these families accomplished was essentially the reinvention of human social organization under extreme stress, Dr. Walsh concluded. They had to rediscover the basic principles of cooperation and resource sharing that had allowed humans to survive as a species for thousands of years. The role of children in these extreme survival situations was particularly remarkable. Far from being burdens or liabilities, children often provided crucial contributions to family survival. They were smaller and required less food and warmth. They were more adaptable to changing conditions, and they often maintained optimism and hope that helped sustain adult morale. Children in survival situations often become the emotional center of the family, Dr. Walsh explained. Adults will endure conditions for their children that they might not endure for themselves, and children often adapt to extreme conditions more readily than adults, providing a model of resilience that helps the entire family. The Weatherby children, for example, had developed games and entertainment that could be played in their limited space. They created stories and songs that helped pass time during the long winter nights. They took on responsibilities for maintaining fires and managing supplies that freed their parents to focus on larger survival issues. The children weren't just surviving, they were growing and developing even under these extreme conditions, Dr. Webb noted in his medical journal. The youngest child had learned to walk during the winter in the cellar. The older children had continued their education and had actually advanced in their reading and mathematics skills. This resilience of children in extreme conditions appeared in multiple accounts of frontier survival. Children seemed to possess an adaptability that allowed them to find normalcy and even joy in conditions that devastated adults. But my research also revealed the long-term psychological effects of extreme frontier sleeping experiences. Many survivors of extreme winter conditions continued to experience sleep-related anxiety throughout their lives. They would wake frequently during the night, checking for threats that no longer existed. They would hoard bedding and clothing, unable to feel secure with normal amounts of these materials. Trauma related to extreme survival experiences often manifests in sleep disturbances that persist for decades, Dr. Walsh explained. The hypervigilance that kept people alive during crisis situations becomes maladaptive in normal circumstances, but the brain has difficulty distinguishing between past danger and current safety. Many frontier survivors also developed what researchers now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, becoming depressed and anxious as winter approached each year, even when they were living in comfortable circumstances. The psychological association between winter and mortal danger was so strong that it continued to affect them even when winter no longer posed real threats. The frontier sleep experience left permanent changes in how people related to safety, comfort, and rest, Dr. Walsh continued. They had learned to associate sleep with vulnerability and winter with danger, and those associations were difficult to unlearn even after moving to safer environments. But there were also positive long-term effects. Many frontier survivors developed extraordinary resilience and adaptability that served them well throughout their lives. They had learned to find solutions to impossible problems, to maintain hope in desperate circumstances, to work cooperatively under extreme stress. The survival skills they developed on the frontier often made them successful in other challenging circumstances, Dr. Walsh noted. They had learned not just how to survive physical hardship, but how to maintain psychological stability under extreme stress. These were valuable life skills that served them well in whatever circumstances they encountered later. The frontier sleep experience also created unique bonds between family members that persisted throughout their lives. Families who had survived extreme winter conditions together often maintained unusually close relationships, having shared experiences that few others could understand. There's a particular intimacy that comes from having shared life or death situations, Dr. Walsh explained. Families who survived extreme frontier conditions often described feeling that no other relationship could compare to the bonds they had formed during those survival experiences. These family bonds often extended to the broader frontier community. Families who had survived extreme conditions would often help other families facing similar challenges, sharing knowledge and resources that could mean the difference between survival and death. The frontier sleep culture created networks of mutual support that were essential for community survival, Dr. Morrison, the social historian, explained. Families would share survival techniques, loan resources during emergencies, and provide care for families who were struggling with extreme conditions. This mutual support system was particularly important for families with young children or elderly members who were more vulnerable to extreme conditions. The community would often rally to help these families prepare for winter, providing additional bedding, firewood, or food that might make the difference between survival and tragedy. The frontier communities that survived were those that developed strong mutual support systems, Dr. Morrison continued. Individual families might have remarkable survival skills, but no family could survive completely alone. Community cooperation was essential for long-term survival. The knowledge transmission systems that developed around frontier sleep were remarkably sophisticated. Experienced families would formally teach survival techniques to newer settlers, often through hands-on demonstrations and practice sessions. Children would be sent to stay with experienced families during particularly harsh winters, not just for safety, but to learn survival skills. These knowledge transmission systems were essentially educational institutions focused on survival, Dr. Morrison explained. They ensured that hard-won survival knowledge wasn't lost when experienced settlers died or moved away. The knowledge was continuously refined and improved as new techniques were developed and tested. Women played a particularly crucial role in these knowledge transmission systems. They were responsible for teaching textile management, food preservation, childcare, and household management techniques that were essential for winter survival. They also maintained the social networks that allowed families to support each other during emergencies. Women's knowledge networks were the backbone of frontier community survival, Dr. Morrison continued. They shared techniques for everything from treating frostbite to preparing foods that would provide energy throughout long winter nights. They also maintained the social relationships that made community cooperation possible. The role of elderly people in frontier sleep culture was complex. While elderly people were more vulnerable to extreme conditions, they also possessed knowledge and experience that could be crucial for family survival. Elderly people often knew techniques for weather prediction, resource management, and psychological survival that they had learned during previous crisis situations. Frontier families often organized their sleeping arrangements specifically to protect elderly family members, Dr. Morrison explained. But they also positioned elderly people where their knowledge and experience could be most valuable. An elderly person might sleep in the warmest spot, but they would also be responsible for maintaining fires, monitoring weather conditions, and providing guidance during crisis situations. The relationship between religion and frontier sleep was also significant. Many families turned to religious practices for psychological support during extreme conditions. Prayer, hymn singing, and Bible reading became important elements of evening routines that helped families maintain hope and cohesion. Religious practices provided psychological anchoring that was crucial for survival, Dr. Walsh explained. They gave families a framework for understanding their suffering and a source of hope that they would survive. They also provided rituals and routines that helped maintain social cohesion during extreme stress. Some families developed religious interpretations of their survival experiences that helped them make sense of the extreme conditions they endured. They might see their survival as evidence of divine protection, or interpret their dreams and visions as religious experiences. Faith often provided the psychological strength necessary to endure conditions that might otherwise have broken people's will to survive, Dr. Walsh continued. Whether or not their religious interpretations were objectively true, they provided subjective meaning that helped people continue fighting for survival. The frontier sleep experience also had significant effects on gender roles and family structure. Traditional gender distinctions often broke down under extreme survival conditions, as everyone had to contribute whatever skills and abilities they possessed, regardless of conventional social expectations. Women might take on responsibilities for maintaining fires and providing security that would normally have been men's work, Dr. Morrison explained. Men might take on cooking and childcare responsibilities that would normally have been women's work. Survival needs trumped social conventions. Children also took on adult responsibilities much earlier than they would have in more settled circumstances. Young children might be responsible for maintaining fires, caring for younger siblings, or helping with food preparation and resource management. The frontier experience accelerated childhood development in many ways, Dr. Morrison continued. Children learned adult skills much earlier because family survival depended on everyone contributing to their full capacity. But this also meant that childhood as a protected period of development was much shorter. The effects of extreme frontier sleeping conditions on human development were profound and lasting. People who survived these experiences were changed in fundamental ways that affected how they lived for the rest of their lives, but they were also the people who built the foundation for everything that came after. Their survival techniques became the basis for improved technologies and methods. Their communities became the foundation for more permanent settlements. Their knowledge became the inheritance that made comfort and safety possible for future generations. As I conclude this research, I'm struck by the remarkable resilience and adaptability that these frontier families demonstrated. They faced conditions that would challenge the survival of modern people with all our technological advantages. Yet they not only survived, they created communities, raised families, and built the foundation for the civilization that followed. Their sleep was not the comfortable, private, safe sleep that we take for granted today. It was communal, vigilant, and constantly threatened by forces beyond their control. But it was enough. It kept them alive through the most challenging conditions humans can endure, and it allowed them to pass on to future generations the knowledge and strength that made our comfort possible. The frontier sleep experience reminds us that human beings are capable of adapting to almost any conditions when survival is at stake. We can learn to sleep in spaces that seem uninhabitable, to share resources under the most extreme scarcity, to maintain hope and community even when faced with apparently insurmountable challenges. These are not just historical curiosities. They are reminders of capabilities that still exist within us, even though we rarely need to access them. The frontier families who slept in freezing cabins and collapsed root cellars were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who discovered extraordinary capacities for adaptation and survival. Their stories remind us that comfort and safety are precious gifts that should never be taken for granted. The warm beds and secure homes we enjoy today were built on a foundation of sacrifice and struggle that we can barely imagine. Every comfortable night's sleep we enjoy is a victory that was won by people who slept in conditions that would terrify us. But their stories also remind us that human beings are capable of surviving and even thriving in the most challenging circumstances. We have within us the same adaptability, the same resilience, the same capacity for community and mutual support that allowed frontier families to survive the impossible. As we face the challenges of our own time, whether personal, community, or global, we can draw inspiration from these frontier families who faced their own impossible challenges and found ways to survive and build better lives for their children. The frontier sleep experience was harsh, demanding, and often tragic. But it was also a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the power of community cooperation. It reminds us that we are stronger than we know, more adaptable than we imagine, and more capable of mutual support than we often remember. In the final analysis, my 3 years of researching frontier sleep revealed something profound about the human condition. Sleep, which we think of as a private, individual experience, becomes fundamentally communal when survival is at stake. The frontier families who shared body heat under buffalo robes, who took turns maintaining fires through winter nights, who developed elaborate systems for rotating sleep shifts. They were rediscovering forms of human cooperation that our species had practiced for thousands of years. Modern sleep science tells us that humans originally slept in groups for protection and warmth. Our ancestors gathered around fires, arranged themselves for mutual protection, and maintained collective vigilance against threats. The comfortable private bedrooms we know today are actually a very recent innovation in human history. The frontier experience forced European settlers to return to these ancient patterns of communal sleep, but they had to rediscover the social protocols and survival techniques that made such arrangements work. They had to learn how to share space, heat, and resources while maintaining the individual identity and family structures that were central to their cultural identity. Dr. Amanda Foster, the physiologist who had helped me understand the medical aspects of cold weather survival, provided insights into the biological implications of frontier sleep patterns. The human body is actually well adapted for the kind of sleep patterns that frontier families practiced, she explained during our final interview. Our natural circadian rhythms include periods of lighter sleep that would have allowed for monitoring threats and maintaining fires. The biphasic sleep pattern that frontier families often developed, sleeping for a few hours, waking for a period of quiet activity, then sleeping again, was actually closer to our natural sleep patterns than the 8-hour blocks of continuous sleep that modern people expect. Before electric lighting, most humans slept in 2 phases with a period of wakefulness in between, Dr. Foster continued. This wasn't insomnia, it was normal. The frontier families who developed these patterns were actually returning to sleep rhythms that had been natural for humans throughout most of our evolutionary history. The health effects of frontier sleep were complex. The constant stress and poor conditions certainly took a toll on physical health, but the strong social bonds, the sense of purpose and meaning, and the physical fitness required for frontier life also provided health benefits that partially offset the harsh conditions. Frontier families often developed remarkable physical resilience, Dr. Foster explained. Their bodies adapted to cold stress, irregular sleep patterns, and limited nutrition in ways that made them extraordinarily hardy. They might not have lived as long as modern people, but they were often remarkably healthy and resilient within their shorter lifespans. The mental health effects were similarly complex. The constant stress and danger certainly contributed to anxiety and trauma-related problems. But the strong community bonds, the sense of shared purpose, and the meaningful work of survival also provided psychological benefits that are often missing from modern life. Frontier families had a clarity of purpose that many modern people lack, Dr. Walsh, the trauma psychologist, reflected. Their goals were immediate and concrete: stay warm, stay fed, stay alive until spring. This kind of clear, immediate purpose can actually be psychologically protective, even under harsh conditions. The social effects of frontier sleep extended far beyond the immediate families who practiced it. The survival techniques and community cooperation patterns that developed around winter sleep became the foundation for frontier society as a whole. Towns and settlements that developed effective systems for sharing resources and supporting families during harsh winters were more likely to survive and grow. Communities that failed to develop these cooperative systems often collapsed during particularly harsh winters, with surviving families moving to more cooperative settlements. The frontier sleep culture was essentially a laboratory for testing different models of human cooperation under extreme stress. Dr. Morrison, the social historian, concluded, "The communities that survived were those that found effective ways to balance individual needs with collective survival requirements. These successful cooperation models became the foundation for many of the social institutions that characterized the American West. Mutual aid societies, community granaries, shared equipment cooperatives, and informal networks of resource sharing all had their roots in the survival cooperation that developed around winter sleep. The technological innovations that emerged from frontier sleep research were also significant. The heating techniques, insulation methods, and textile technologies that families developed to survive winter conditions became the basis for improved building techniques, better clothing design, and more efficient heating systems. Many of the innovations in American building technology can be traced back to techniques that frontier families developed for creating warm, efficient sleeping spaces, explained Dr. Chen, the thermal engineer. The principles of thermal mass, air circulation, and insulation that we use in modern building design were often discovered by families trying to create survivable sleeping conditions in crude frontier cabins. The clothing and textile innovations were equally significant. The layering systems that frontier families developed for sleeping warmth became the foundation for modern outdoor clothing design. The techniques for modifying and adapting clothing for specific conditions influenced the development of specialized work clothing and outdoor gear. The modern outdoor clothing industry owes a significant debt to the innovations that frontier families developed, explained Dr. Wright, the clothing historian. The principles of moisture management, insulation, and layering that we take for granted in modern outdoor gear were often discovered by necessity by families trying to stay warm through winter nights. But perhaps the most significant legacy of frontier sleep culture was its demonstration of human adaptability and resilience. The families who survived impossible winters showed that human beings are capable of adapting to almost any conditions when survival is at stake. This adaptability wasn't just physical, it was psychological, social, and cultural. Frontier families had to reimagine fundamental aspects of human life: privacy, individual space, family roles, community relationships, and the meaning of comfort and security. The frontier sleep experience shows us that human culture is far more flexible and adaptable than we often realize, Dr. Morrison reflected. When circumstances demand it, people can rapidly develop new social forms, new technologies, and new ways of understanding what it means to be human. This adaptability is particularly relevant as we face the challenges of our own time. Climate change, resource scarcity, social disruption, and technological transformation are creating conditions that may require new forms of human cooperation and adaptation. The frontier families who survived impossible winters demonstrate that humans can adapt to changing conditions much more rapidly and effectively than we often assume, Dr. Morrison continued. They show us that we have capacities for cooperation, innovation, and resilience that we rarely need to access under normal conditions. The frontier sleep experience also reminds us of the importance of community and mutual support in human survival. The families who survived did so not just because of their individual skills and determination, but because they developed effective systems for working together and supporting each other. Individual heroism makes for good stories, but community cooperation is what actually ensures survival, Dr. Walsh observed. The frontier families who survived understood that their individual survival depended on the survival of their community, and they organized their lives accordingly. This understanding of interdependence is something that modern individualistic culture often obscures. We tend to think of ourselves as independent actors who succeed or fail based on our individual efforts. But the frontier experience demonstrates that human survival and thriving have always been fundamentally communal enterprises. The frontier sleep culture also demonstrates the importance of maintaining hope and meaning under difficult circumstances. The families who survived the harshest conditions were not just those with the best survival skills, but those who found ways to maintain psychological resilience and community morale. Survival is not just about meeting physical needs, Dr. Walsh reflected. It's about maintaining the psychological and social bonds that make life worth living. The frontier families who survived understood this intuitively, and they invested enormous energy in maintaining community relationships and shared meaning. The rituals, traditions, and social practices that frontier families developed around sleep were not just practical necessities. They were ways of creating meaning and maintaining human dignity under dehumanizing conditions. The evening routines, the storytelling, the dream sharing, the communal decision-making, these weren't luxuries that families could afford when they had time, Dr. Walsh continued. They were essential elements of psychological survival that were just as important as staying warm and fed. This understanding of the relationship between meaning and survival is particularly relevant for modern people facing their own challenges and difficulties. The frontier experience suggests that our capacity to survive and thrive depends not just on our material resources, but on our ability to maintain hope, community, and shared purpose. As I reflect on the 3 years I spent researching frontier sleep, I'm struck by how much this historical experience can teach us about our own lives and our own challenges. The frontier families who slept in freezing cabins were not living in some distant, irrelevant past. They were exploring fundamental questions about human nature and human capacity that remain relevant today. How much can humans adapt to changing conditions? How do we balance individual needs with collective survival? How do we maintain hope and community under extreme stress? How do we find meaning in the midst of suffering? These are questions that every generation must answer in their own way. The frontier sleep experience provides one set of answers to these questions. Answers that were developed under extreme conditions by ordinary people who discovered extraordinary capacities within themselves. Their answers may not directly apply to our own circumstances, but they demonstrate possibilities for human adaptation and cooperation that can inspire our own responses to challenge and change. The families who survived those harsh frontier winters did more than just survive. They built the foundation for everything that came after. The communities they created, the technologies they developed, the social institutions they established, and the values they embodied became the inheritance that made our own comfort and security possible. Their sleep was troubled, communal, and constantly threatened. But it was enough to carry them through the darkest nights and the harshest conditions that humans can endure. And in their survival, they demonstrated capacities for resilience, adaptation, and mutual support that remain within us today. As we face our own challenges, whether personal, community, or global, we can draw inspiration from these frontier families who faced their own impossible circumstances and found ways not just to survive, but to build better lives for their children. Their stories remind us that we are stronger than we know, more adaptable than we imagine, and more capable of cooperation and mutual support than we often remember. The frontier sleep experience was a testament to human resilience in its purest form. Ordinary people discovering extraordinary capacities when survival demanded nothing less. The cold that once threatened to claim them has long since passed. The cabins they built have returned to earth. The fires they tended have gone cold. But the example they set of courage, cooperation, and refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds remains as a legacy for all who face their own dark winters. In our warm beds tonight, safe from the dangers that once threatened every moment of sleep, we can honor their memory by remembering that our comfort was built on their sacrifice, our security was purchased with their struggle, and our peace was earned through their persistence. They slept so that we might rest. They endured so that we might be comfortable. They survived so that we might thrive. And in their survival, they showed us that no winter lasts forever, no matter how dark or cold it may seem. Spring always comes to those who can endure until morning. Warmth always returns to those who can keep the fire burning through the longest night. Their gift to us is not just the material comfort we enjoy, but the knowledge that human beings can survive and overcome almost any challenge when we work together with courage, determination, and hope. The frontier sleep experience reminds us that we are all part of a long chain of survivors stretching back through time, each generation facing their own challenges, developing their own solutions, and passing on their wisdom and strength to those who come after. We are the inheritors of their courage, the beneficiaries of their sacrifice, and the guardians of their legacy. And someday, we too will be remembered by future generations who will wonder how we survived our own challenging times, and what we did to build a better world for our children. The story of frontier sleep is ultimately a story about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and overcome. It's a story that belongs not just to the past, but to every generation that faces uncertainty and challenge with courage and hope. May we be worthy inheritors of their legacy. May we face our own challenges with the same courage they showed, and may we pass on to our children a world that is safer, warmer, and more secure than the one we inherited. The fire they tended has passed to us. It's our responsibility now to keep it burning bright. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most challenging chapters. If this exploration brought you some peace tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. I research and share these forgotten stories regularly, always looking for the human truths hidden in historical details. There's another story waiting for you, or you can simply rest here, knowing that you're part of a long chain of sleepers stretching back through time, each generation building the comfort that the next would inherit. Sleep well until our paths cross again.